Welcome back, everyone. For those of you who are sweeping back into the main room here from the showcase sessions, hope you enjoyed those and had a good chance to engage with people and learn more about the various implementations that people have been making with the CLRs across the country. So this is a chance for us to, at the end of our showcase, to take a few moments to really look forward and think about where this will be moving. And so I've asked three folks to join me here today. You can see them on the screen. We've got Phil Long, who was just in our last panel from T3, so I'm sure you've had a little chance to meet him with it. But then also from our very first panel of the showcase, Dr. Amelia Parnell from NASPA and the Executive Director of AACRAO, Mike Riley. So let's start with Mike. This is your first panel here. Folks have not had a chance to meet you yet as part of the showcase. Tell us a little bit about AACRAO's work and its relationship to this topic of CLRs.
Thanks, Tom. Welcome, everybody. Of course, you know a good bit about AACRAO. We've been around a long time, 110 years. We represent registrars, admissions and enrollment management professionals. And we have been debating about what a transcript should look like since 1910. And in fact, at our very first meeting in 1910, 30 registrars came together in Detroit. They formed a little subcommittee to work on the details of a transcript, and we're still working on it. So it's obviously been an important issue for us. So kind of reflecting back here, and we started, first, we did the right thing by focusing on students when we first started in this work. I mean, that allowed us to really gather the formative dimension of this, and you've heard a lot of that discussed during the conversation. We made clear that CLRs did not necessarily replace traditional transcripts. That helped bring our registrar colleagues in. They're not worried that we're going to completely blow this up. But certainly now that we've done that, as we move forward, we need to start thinking about the other audience that learners want to share their records with. And of course, that certainly includes employers. So that's why the partnerships with the T3 network and the Chamber of Commerce Foundation are really so important, because that is an important next step. We have a standard to be able to use. And I'll be honest with you, when we first started, we really thought, let's not worry too much about standards here. Standards are often best when they kind of work around a convergence of practice. But we did really find fairly early in the project that not having a standard wasn't a bit of an impediment to us moving forward. So thanks to IMS Global and the work that Tom and AACRAO and the partnership to develop a standard. So moving forward, we really do, with the standard and other tools, need to make CLRs easier for campuses to implement. That's why it's so exciting in this gathering to see all the solutions out there, that we have companies that are embracing the new standard, embracing the CLR, and helping it make it easier, because we're not going to do these, we're not going to build these independently on our campuses. And then I think you talked about this some earlier. We need to start thinking about institutions not just being producers of CLRs, but consumers. And we know that the transcript has actually served the academy pretty well. That wasn't necessarily a solution we needed to fix. It has facilitated transfer. Graduate deans know how to use it to admit students to graduate programs. But the CLR could help with some of the shortcomings of the transcript. One, for example, I think about an independent study. Brenda, you probably call it, English 499 or something. And then the recipient institution says, what do I do with this? We don't have enough information. But in particular, I think PLA is an area we need to look at. From our research, we know that the majority of institutions will not accept PLA and transfer if it's indicated as PLA on a transcript. They'll just cross it out, force the student to lose that credit and go through another set of hurdles to be able to get the credit. Some of that is because the institutions just don't have enough information about how the credit was awarded. And now with the CLR, we can see learning outcomes, we can see competencies, perhaps assessments. perhaps artifacts of learning, and give a lot more confidence to the institution to be able to recognize that learning. And the other thing that I think this will help with is to break us of this notion that the only credit that's worthy of going against a college degree is that earned in a structured course. I mean, we're just so wedded to that concept. And once you don't fixate on how the student acquired the knowledge, but that they have the knowledge, then I think that opens up lots of opportunities for things like PLA. And we also saw in the conversation earlier that we're going to become consumers from records coming from the secondary level. We already see that with the mastery transcript that's beginning to develop. There's consortiums of schools doing that. We know that high schools have asked colleges and universities to recognize the portfolios of students as part of the admissions process. And from the IMS Global meeting that a number of us joined, boy, it seems like an eternity ago, but it was in Atlanta, maybe a year ago. I see a lot of my colleagues who were there. We were pleased to learn that secondary schools are beginning to produce comprehensive learner records. So I think once that's sort of the dream of this, is more of a continuum from secondary, used in admissions, part of the learning process at colleges, into employers for employment purposes, used as part of training and employment, and then lifelong learning. So that's where I think the future of this is, Tom.
That's great, Mike. Yeah, we're not talking about one-offs in a lot of the secondary schools. Broward County, Florida, and the state of North Dakota, among a lot of institutions who are interested in the mastery transcript. And yes, I remember about a year ago being in the state of Washington and talking to their education board about this concept of the CLR, because as a state, they're interested in this. So a lot of traction is coming at us. So whether we're ready for CLRs or not, we may be getting them, and need to make sure that we're ready to understand them and use them sensibly in that. Great, thank you very much. Thank you for coming back as a bookend to this, from our first panel to this one that we're closing out the meeting on. Tell us a little bit more about NASPA. For those of folks who are here visiting today who might be from outside of higher ed directly, or may not be as familiar with NASPA as an organization, first tell us a little bit about that, and then a little bit about NASPA's association with this work.
Mm-hmm. So NASPA as a membership association is probably similar to what you would expect from AACRAO or any of the other membership associations in higher education, in that our primary purpose is, of course, to convene professionals from across the country and provide professional development, training, services, and a sense of community and all the things that you would expect. I think within the function of student affairs, which is the primary focus of NASPA, there have been a lot of conversations about what students need to have a holistic and integrated learning experience, social experience, academic experience, all the things that you would say would make a student feel like they had a rich opportunity to learn as much as possible in a welcoming and inclusive environment. So as a result, NASPA's portfolio of topics and issues and services ranges from things that probably would be far outside of the scope of this conversation, but definitely relevant to the student experience. So equity, inclusion, diversity, social justice, mental health, well-being initiatives, housing, academic advising, career advising. And so the list goes on and on and on. And so as a result, I think that for decades, there have been a lot of professionals who are connected to NASPA or just connected to student affairs that have been saying students have been learning in all types of environments. And I think first efforts to document that, similar to the traditional transcript, have been a co-curricular transcript, which might look at first as like a listing of clubs and activities associated with what term you did it in and how many hours. And that was fine for a period of time. I think if we can go back to the 90s, maybe early 2000s, that was there. But the same sentiment that Mike expressed, I think the same thing was happening in student affairs, which is that's a good start, but does it really show where the learning actually happens? And so I think the meeting that Mike Riley and Kevin Kruger from NASPA, who says hello, had to just start this conversation and say, where could we go with this, led us to a really special place. And I don't know if, Tom, you remember this, but almost 5 years ago to the day, around the same time as a terrible snowstorm that came to DC, we hosted a separate discussion with about 20 schools who all wrote us immediately after that press release came out. And they said, I want to be a part of this project. And we knew we could only choose 8 schools, but we didn't want to miss the opportunity to talk to some schools who said, we have great great interest. We think we'd like to do this. And it was a whole day of conversations. And we said, where would you like to go from here? And they actually outlined several of the things from these conversations, like how can we make these records integrate with our student information system? How can we get more buy-in from faculty and others and things like that? So NASPA, I think for a long time has been, holding the flag up to say we have been providing rich learning experiences outside the classroom. But I do think we needed a vehicle to make it more concrete and more widely used. And so I think as a result, we'll start to see some of those schools that have been watching on the sidelines a little bit longer say, now that I see what the comprehensive learner record looks like, how can we actually adopt this and put this through, our regular day-to-day work? And so I think in the future, we'll see maybe two things that I would highlight. One is the team of professionals that are involved in delivering these records expand significantly. I think through the last several years, we've been talking very heavily about the partnership between not just AACRAO and NASPA, but student affairs and the registrar. And then, of course, we see campuses also bring in faculty. But I think that there are two additional groups that will be integral to this, actually maybe three. The communications department at the campus or even within divisions, just to get the word out. I think advising offices, those who are actually working directly with students to tell them what their options are, and any function that has the role of assessment or institutional research or a primary use of data to show the effectiveness of these records on students' progression on the campus. So the future for us probably holds more of the same, which is that we'll still be saying that opportunities exist outside the classroom to be learning. And I think if anything, I'll continue to bug Tom and Mike and others on this call to see what we can do to keep the momentum going. So I won't hog all the time, but I hope that sums up a little bit about NASPA and our approach.
Oh, that's great. That's fantastic.
You
I
forgot about that
remember,
meeting. Yeah.
I remember the meeting. I forgot about the snowstorm. Maybe that's like certain kinds of pain that they just
They just put it out of your memory. Yeah.
point there. Yeah, thank you very much. And we'll probably come back and visit a couple of the points that you made there because they're really good ones, Amelia. Phil, you were just on a panel we were talking about, but I wanted to offer you a chance just to talk a little bit more about T3 and the aims of T3. How did it come to be with it? And then also just kind of talk a little bit about, T3's interest in partnering with the higher education community.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. Well, T3 started, I think, with the interest in the business world coming from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce itself, which sponsored the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. And in most significantly, their concerns there had been trying to smooth the friction, if you will, out of the talent pipeline, both at the intake end and as people moved across organizations or upwards within their organizations. And so the first area of focus of T3 was about that. And the interest to move or open consideration more broadly, particularly with respect to higher education, was driven by the employers who were frustrated by what some degree of discernment of the signals that are coming from their traditional transcripts in terms of their ability to map skills and capabilities that those signals presented to the actual jobs people had. And so there was a concern about the amount of energy that was being spent to validate what the transcript was telling an individual employer about the capabilities of the student for particular jobs. And that led to a recognition that there needed to be a much deeper partnership with organizations like yourselves and IMS Global and others, because the only way forward we all seemed to agree on at the beginning was that it has to be standards based. We can all solve this problem in our own little cliques, and we may solve it to a certain degree, but it won't solve it for our students as a community because they are transient. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean that in that we are looking at, many people are starting to think about it in terms of the 60-year curriculum, people coming in and out of institutions over time and needing to be able to have what they were doing before be recognized in the various forms that they acquired it. The PLA, the prior learning assessment is a classic example of that, but also in terms of the other kinds of skills and documentation that are proliferating in terms of different types of certificates and badges and short programs and things of that sort, which may or may not be stackable. And if so, what's the mapping among these things? And so that complexity led, I think, the T3 to think about we really need to have standards. We really need to focus on interoperability amongst those standards. And we need to focus on practical examples that bring these things together so we can learn from those processes. And the main thing that was driving it was a recognition that, at least from the technology perspective, the movement is towards decentralization. And decentralization at the same time prioritizes the learner. And that is in alignment with a lot of learner-centric pedagogical practice evolution and the like, which we think is perfectly dovetailing with the way in which the technology is moving. So that's kind of the background.
Great. Oh, thank you, Phil. And you know, your point there that you made about the transcript, I want to throw this back to Mike a little bit, is that, you know, when we look at the transcript and even try and read it, right, you almost have to be a code breaker at times because, you know, and it's still true in a lot of systems today, but has been true, you know, more in the past, that you only got a certain number of characters to even put the course title on the transcript. And I think some of them wound up without even a vowel, much less a space. So trying to understand what was on a transcript became kind of a mysterious adventure for people. And I think we've all had our experiences or seen, you know, folks who are struggling with that. And, you know, on the inside of it, as registrars and records professionals, admissions professionals, we know probably more about that decoding, right, than others. But take that outside of the academy, and or even to other parts of the academy, it becomes much less clear for people. Mike, you're muted.
Sorry, I was going to say the panel we had at the tech transfer meeting in Austin, Texas, as a matter of fact, all three of the employers to a person said, we don't use transcripts. They don't add any value. So it's a little stab in the heart to those of us who are in the transcript business, but we get it.
Yeah, and you know that I remember that really well. That was something that, you know, stuck, or a pain that didn't go away. Was, you know, hearing all three of those young CEOs with, you know, really promising tech startups, the exact kind of businesses that we want our graduates to be able to move to, tell us that the thing we've been producing for maybe 1,000 years, right, this ledger type of record, was essentially not really much of anything for them except validating that the student had the credential they had.
Right.
Even then, I remember being in an airport one night and seeing somebody doing interviews with someone on a cell phone, and had all these papers scattered around him, and they were unofficial transcripts from students. And I thought, don't you know, buddy, that's worthless, you know. So, but of course, you know, they mean a lot to us inside the academy. Amelia, I want to come back to you because you raised this really interesting point in there about the recognition that learning is happening outside the classroom. And I've said this a few times as we've been doing this work. If I went back 10 years and certainly 20 years, that conversation would be very different with faculty.
Mhm.
I think that a lot of faculty have not only sponsored that kind of out of the classroom learning, but are very much accepting of it. But when we think about partnering with that between student affairs and academic affairs, the assessment
Mhm.
of learning comes up. And you've spoken at great length about assessment outside the classroom. So share a little bit about where we're at with assessment outside the classroom, and maybe where it needs to go in the future.
Yeah, so I think in some ways, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I feel pretty confident that on some campuses, I don't want to call it the divide, but maybe the relationship between student affairs and academic affairs is still a work in progress. I remember very vividly a point when someone at a NASPA conference pulled me to the side and said, "Hey, Amelia, this is a really great presentation. I think, Tom, you were probably there too." And they said, just as long as we're clear, though, that learning happens in the classroom and engagement happens outside the classroom, then we'll probably move just fine. And I would be glad to work with student affairs and have them put some of those engagement things there. And I'm sure there's some learning that happens. And so, Mike, like you said, it twists the knife a little bit when they said that they don't look at it. That kind of just had a little bit of a slow burn. I was like, "Whew, that you how to respond in real time." So there will probably still be those conversations about how far can you actually validate learning that you don't have dedicated structures that you would expect in the classroom to map to. But I do think we are farther along, because of, I think, accrediting bodies now saying where are the places where students are learning everywhere. So some of that conversation is going to get a natural groundswell because others are actually starting to assert this. But if I'm being honest, I think that the starting point for learning outcomes, I actually don't have a problem if it starts in many instances with the faculty, but in partnership with student affairs, so that maybe the student, being the recipient of both sides, can see a consistency between the two. So I hopefully have not given the impression that student affairs should go off on its own and create completely separate learning outcomes that don't match. I know that's not what you're thinking, but I think there are some that probably will say if they don't win that relationship struggle, they will do that. In which case, it could be a little bit confusing. I think in the future there will still be a need to, at some point though, determine what the measurements of learning are going to be. So all of the things Dr. Baker said, regardless of who starts the conversation and who makes the decision, there's got to be some consistent framework or some approach used to actually assess the learning. Because if not, then it ends up being just another checkbox to say, we think you did this or that. The future of all this, and a really great example that I think I would highlight, and kudos to Indiana State if they're still on the call, is student employment or any type of on-campus employment, because that's something you actually can connect to tangible skill sets and competencies that could probably end up on the record that would be validated in some regard. So, and those on-campus experiences don't have to be limited to outside the classroom. You could work with a faculty member. I could see some undergraduate research and things like that. So there are natural synergies and connections that would work, but I think we've made progress, Tom. I'm hopeful that that relationship is improving, but if I'm being honest, we got some ways to go. But I'm optimistic that we'll get farther along than we were.
No, it's great, and I think it speaks to that issue of trust, because we've made the point, well, others have made the point, not we, those, but saying that we don't go out to the biology professor and demand to see all the quizzes and tests to make sure the B that was
Right.
presented by the faculty is actually a B, right? We trust that there's a governance process and a rigor and a consistency that provides us a grade that we can represent on transcript, and that we need to have just as much trust in that when that assessment comes in from outside of that structure. And oftentimes those are assessments coming in the co-curriculum. But I think the more we see internships, research, study abroad, things that are being offered by faculty outside of the traditional classroom, I think the partnership just continues to grow. Yeah. So I want to take up one more topic, and that is, what do we need to pay attention to as we move into the future here? And Phil, I want to throw this one to you first. What are the things that we need to pay attention to moving forward on these issues? Phil, you're muted.
Sorry about that.
Right.
One of the first is one that's been around for a while, and I think I mentioned it briefly in a prior panel, but right now the issue of trust around these kinds of records is being addressed through some sort of proofing mechanism that allows you to cryptographically assert that the Indiana transcript was actually issued by Indiana and not someone else. And the part that's been missing in all of that part's been relatively easier to do. But the part that's been missing is that it doesn't necessarily prove that Phil Long, that's mentioned in that transcript, is actually the person presenting that transcript. And I say it that way because we are moving towards this model of enabling individual learners to have control over their own credentials and send them. And the premise of that is that the institution is able to believe that when they hand the transcript over to an individual, it doesn't have to have that stamp that says unofficial on it, because it can't be edited, modified, or changed without indication of such visible to the individual or company that it's being given to. In the past, that wasn't just technically possible. And this is a major transition and major change, that where we now can give something to somebody else with absolute certainty that they can't modify it in any way to plagiarize or embellish or otherwise make that transcript other than the one that institution issued. And if they try, it'll be discernible. The same is true with identity, though, of the person presenting it. And we haven't solved that one yet. That's really in the future looking ahead, we need to make those two things come together. So the same trust that Indiana or North Texas is the issuer of this particular certificate or transcript, and Jane Smith is the person that's presenting it, is that person that's referred to in that transcript. That needs to be asserted and proofed as well. And that's where we are right now with the evolution of DIDs, distributed identifiers, digital identifiers, and a rapid evolution in that space, which will allow us to be able to pull these two sides of the problem together. And I think the last thing I'll mention is that all of this is dependent on the interest in and the adoption of by employers or the consumers of these transcripts into their utilization and the value proposition that they acquire from it. Because if it doesn't help them save money, do a better job at the matching process, improve retention as a consequence, then it's not helping.
Great, wonderful, yeah. Amelia, how about you? What would you mention as the areas to pay attention to for the future?
I would say two. The first is probably a question that we got a lot, very in the early stages of this, which was, are you all trying to assert there would now be one record that has all things classroom, all things outside the classroom, and the two don't need to be separate anymore? To which time we said, hey, I know that's a big shock to the system. That's not what we're saying right now, but I think that question is going to come back. I think as the conversations around blockchain and people being able to have portable records of some type that go in and out of their educational experience and maybe into the workforce, we might come back to that conversation about what a comprehensive learner record looks like across all the different places where students might be picking up skills and competencies. So that's the first one. The second is, I think, this influence from outside companies. And so I'm happy that we had a good number of companies that are connected to this work here doing a showcase, but I think there'll be even more. Those who, once this groundswell continues on, will say, we can provide something to you at a low cost. And so I think that will help with continued adoption of these records. So those are the two top of mind for me.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Mike, how about you?
Well, I'd mentioned a challenge we identified in the very first phase of this project was the data integration on campuses. In fact, it was such an issue that in the second phase, we particularly focused on it and put a group together. Our student information systems were designed to be enterprise systems, but of course we found shortcomings and we ended up bolting on lots of products as individual solutions that don't necessarily speak to each other. I sort of call it the Mr. Potato Head problem, where you can, attach things. And so when you do that, you end up with something that looks like this, when in fact, it's designed to look like this. So I would just encourage us to continue working on the data integration challenge. The student affairs folks may have something in an e-portfolio, there's stuff in the LMS, the department chair has something on a spreadsheet. You got something in the e-catalog. So that's one where our corporate partners can really step in because you're not going to just solve this by pulling out resources on your own campus. Not everybody is resourced like that. So I encourage innovation in that regard.
Thank you very much. And I just want to thank all our panelists, Mike Riley, Dr. Amelia Parnell, Phil Long. Thank you so much for being on the panel today. What a great way to our last panel to wrap this up. And I'm just going to close with a little bit of housekeeping, but also a few things about where this might be going. Because as we feel we're pivoting in a way from the work we've been able to do through Lumina Foundation, we want to continue the work and make sure that people have appropriate places to take this as well. So first off, I wanted to mention the T3 Innovation Network that Phil is here representing today. If you're interested in being in a pilot project, make sure and look at that and find out how your CLR project can become linked to something like a pilot employer or a pilot agency or military branch. But also there's a lot more going on in this project with T3 trying to connect to the world of business. And so I put a couple links in the slide there. Also wanted to shout out to APHIS, who, as we began to wrap things up here, came forward and offered to offer a space for people who would like to connect and get together and continue to talk about CLR or enter into the conversation on CLR through their APHIS Academy. They're starting a CLR incubator group. And so it'll be a place to learn, teach, collaborate, and innovate on key initiatives and continue this work moving forward. So thank you so much for Mustafa, Suzanne, Natasha for helping to generate that. Just a quick reminder to anyone who presented today, it's been in the chat, but we really do want to be able to collect all of your slides or examples that you used in the showcases, because many of the people who are here are interested in being able to review those or share them or show examples of them to colleagues. So please make sure and send those to Amelia and me. It would be very unfortunate if we ended this without many, many thanks to all the people who have been helping us here, not the least of which are in AACRAO Consulting, Nicole and Michelle, who have been so instrumental in making sure that this thing operated for 5 years and was organized and together. Also, our thanks to Melanie, Quintina, and Faduma and AACRAO Communications for putting up the website, for getting this event put together. You did amazing work, and I now am a Slack expert as a result of your initiatives. Thank you so much. To Mike and Summer, who helped us all navigate this big Zoom meeting for the last couple of days, and all the work that you did to get ready for this as well. We really appreciate it. And also to our IT staff, Greg, Charles, and Matt, for helping to support the backbone of all this IT infrastructure we needed for the meeting. And not the least of which, our fearless leader, Mike Riley. Thank you so much for all of your support of this work. It's been absolutely invaluable. My partners in crime, Amelia, Natasha, Giannina, thank you so much. This has been a real honor and treat to work with you. And also all of our consultants who helped us do this work and reached out to all the institutions to work with them directly. Big debt of gratitude to you, and a huge debt, right, to Lumina for all their support, financial and otherwise, and Dr. Amber Garrison Duncan, who has just been such a great partner in this work. All the solution providers who came together to support us and help us and joined our meeting. We really appreciate that. We could not do this work without your assistance, your technology, and your know-how. Thank you very much. And to all the practitioners, the hundreds of individuals who have been doing this work over the last 5 years, an enormous thank you and shout out to all of you. So thank you so much. This has been fun. Hope you enjoyed your experience in doing the showcase over the last couple of days. And certainly if you have any needs or questions in the future, AACRAO's not going anywhere. So please contact us. The same page you used to register for this event is the page that we have dedicated to the CLR project as one of our signature initiatives, and we'll continue to pursue the work going forward. So thanks to everyone. I hope you had a great time with the meeting, and we hope to see you soon in another venue on record somewhere in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.